The Iron Cage. Episode 2. The Floor Remembers. What happened after the shadows stood up is not something I'm going to describe to you. Some things belong to the people who survived them. What I will tell you is this: they made it to morning, all of them. And the morning was cold and bright and smelled like pine resin and wood smoke. And somewhere on the compound somebody was frying eggs on a Coleman stove. And the smell of those eggs drifting through the Adirondack air was so aggressively, defiantly ordinary that 3 people cried. Not from grief. From the specific overwhelm of beauty that arrives without warning after a night that should have ended differently. The demiurge understands many things about human beings. It has been studying us for 10,000 years. It knows our pressure points and our fault lines, and the precise frequency of despair that makes a burrow go quiet in July. What it did not model for, what it has never been able to model for, is the eggs. The smell of eggs on a Tuesday morning in the Adirondack Mountains after the worst night of your life. That is the thing it cannot touch. Yet, J. Zerga Jr., the heavy metal prophet, Day 1, the Tuesday problem. The compound had a name the founding members had chosen in a Discord server at 2 in the morning 3 years ago when the whole enterprise had felt equal parts visionary and insane. They called it the Clearing. 340 people from 19 countries who had found each other in the digital spaces. The overlay had not yet learned to fully corrupt forums, encrypted servers, the specific corners of the internet where people who noticed things gathered to compare notes on what they had noticed. A retired Mohawk land surveyor from Plattsburgh who had watched the forest behave wrongly for 40 years. A Congolese epidemiologist who had seen something in Kinshasa in 2019 that no peer-reviewed journal would publish. A Welsh mining engineer who had mapped subsidence patterns beneath 3 European cities that formed a geometric shape no natural geological process could explain. A Queens mechanic who had watched Brooklyn commit psychic suicide in July and knew in his bones that the supply chain was not the cause. They had found a former logging camp 30 miles into the Adirondack interior, purchased it through a land trust auction, and spent 18 months converting it into something that could sustain 340 human beings against whatever was coming. They had prepared for the dollar collapsing, for an EMP, for a biological event, for the specific cascade failures of a civilization that had been running on borrowed time and borrowed money for 50 years. They had not prepared for the demiurge, but they were alive on a Tuesday morning and someone was frying eggs. And that was, by any reasonable metric, a victory. Reed Calloway was interviewing the egg fryer. His name was Petrov, 60s, Russian-Finnish, former merchant marine who had seen something in the Baltic in 2018 that had convinced him to find the highest ground available and stay there. He fried eggs the way he did everything else, with the methodical, unhurried competence of a man who had performed tasks in rough seas and understood that panic was a luxury the ocean did not extend. Reed had his recorder out. Dessa was watching him from the communal table with a cup of coffee, and the expression of a woman consulting an internal ledger of grievances that was extensive, but not yet at capacity. You brought the recorder, she said. I bring the recorder everywhere. Reed. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Her nails were black. Her ring silver, a Norse knot she had bought from an Etsy seller in Bergen, Norway, who she was now slightly worried about, caught the morning light. The world ended. The world ending, Reed said, already angling toward Petrov with the recorder extended. Is the story, Des? Dessa looked at Ruth, who was sitting at the far end of the communal table with her grandmother's journal open and a cup of black coffee, and the expression of a woman who had seen this particular dynamic before, in different people across different decades, and had reached a settled conclusion about it. He's going to get himself killed with that recorder, Dessa said. Ruth closed her journal. Probably, she said, but not today. She said it with a certainty that should have been comforting. It wasn't. The Clearing's morning routine had the specific choreography of a community that had survived enough bad nights to understand the value of structure. By 7, the solar array monitoring crew had logged overnight output. By 7:30, the perimeter watch had rotated, and the outgoing crew had filed verbal reports with Jake, who stood at the map table in the operations container with a mug of coffee and the focused stillness of a man running calculations behind his eyes at all times. The overnight report was clean. This was, Jake had learned when to be most concerned. He flagged nothing. He filed the report. He drank his coffee. Across the compound, in the converted logging foreman's office that Marcus had claimed as the archive, floor-to-ceiling shelves of texts, maps pinned across every surface, the specific smell of old paper and intellectual urgency, Marcus was already at his desk. He had been at his desk since 5. He had not slept between 2 and 5, which was not unusual. The hours between 2 and 5 were when the thinking that mattered happened, in his experience, because the overlay's interference in human cognition was weakest in the hours when the fewest humans were broadcasting fear. He had a hypothesis about this that he had not yet shared with anyone, because it had implications he was not ready to present. He was reading the Book of Enoch, specifically the section on the Watchers descending onto the waters. He had a red pen in his hand. He was not using it. Sarah found the circle at 8:47 in the morning. She was not looking for it. She was doing what she did every morning, her social autopsy of the compound's collective psychological state, moving through the spaces where people gathered and reading the room the way other people read text, cataloging microexpressions and body geometries, and the subtle atmospheric data of how human beings positioned themselves in relation to each other and to the spaces they occupied. She was in the workshop row, moving between the mechanic's bay and the medical container, when she saw Rad Calloway stop walking. Not slow down, stop, completely. Mid-stride. He was looking at the ground. Sarah followed his eye line. There was a circle on the packed dirt of the workshop row path. It was approximately 2 feet in diameter. It was the specific black of something that did not reflect light, not dark, not shadowed, but absent. The way a hole is absent. The way the space between stars is absent. The morning light landed on everything around it and stopped at its edge with the precision of a decision. It had no texture, no depth that she could measure with her eyes, no origin she could identify, no tool mark, no burn pattern, no chemical stain. It was simply there. Reed looked at it for 4 seconds. Then he looked up at Sarah. Then he stepped around it and kept walking. The recorder still extended toward Petrov, who was 20 yards ahead. Sarah stood at the edge of the circle. She did not touch it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at where Reed had gone. Then she looked at the circle again. She took out her notebook. She wrote, Reed stopped. Not me. Reed. She underlined Reed twice. By noon, for other people had seen it. By 2 in the afternoon, the number was 11. By 4, when the Adirondack light was doing its specific late afternoon thing, turning the pine canopy the color of old copper, making the mountains in the middle distance look painted rather than real, Marcus had been summoned. Mira had arrived with her instruments, and a loose, uneasy congregation of about 30 compound members had formed at a respectful distance from the circle, which had not moved and had not changed and had not done anything except exist with a patience that felt, to anyone standing near it, like a category rather than a quality. Not patient like a person waiting, patient like a geological formation, patient like something that did not experience time the way the people looking at it experienced time. It's a stress fracture, said a man named Colin. Colin was the compound's structural engineer. He was from Aberdeen. He had built bridges. He had a clipboard and the specific confidence of a man whose entire professional identity rested on the proposition that physical phenomena had physical explanations. Permafrost sublimation, he continued, crouching near the circle with his clipboard at the ready. The ground heaves in these elevations. You get differential settlement, surface cracking. The organic layer separates from the mineral substrate, and you get localized Colin, Mira said. She was standing with a thermal imaging scanner pointed at the circle. The scanner's display was showing her something. Her face was showing everyone else something. What? Colin said. What temperature does a stress fracture read at? Colin stood up slowly. Ambient, he said. It reads at ambient temperature. Yes, Mira said. She turned the scanner so Colin could see the display. The circle read at absolute zero. Not close to absolute zero. Not approximately. Absolute zero. The temperature at which molecular motion stops. The temperature that does not exist in nature on the surface of the Earth. Colin looked at the display for a long time. He straightened his clipboard. Permafrost sublimation, he said again, but quieter. And he walked away, and he did not look back, and he did not speak for the rest of the day. And at dinner he sat alone and moved his food around his plate, with the fork of a man whose professional identity had just been introduced to something it could not survive. Mira ran 7 instruments before the light failed completely. Every one of them malfunctioned within 2 feet of the circle. Not the same malfunction. Different instruments failing in different ways, as if the circle were not simply blocking measurement, but actively engaging with each instrument's specific mechanism and finding the precise point of failure within it. The thermal scanner after the temperature reading, display locked on absolute zero, and would not release regardless of where she pointed it for the next 4 hours. The electromagnetic field detector, spiked to maximum, held for 3 seconds, then displayed a reading that was not on its scale, a negative number, which was not a thing EMF detectors were designed to display, because it was not a thing EMF fields were designed to produce. The ground-penetrating radar returned an image of the subsurface beneath the circle that Mira looked at for 30 seconds, and then turned face down without showing anyone. She would show Marcus later, in private, but not yet. She packed her instruments with the careful, methodical movements of a scientist who had just had her framework introduced to something her framework was not large enough to contain, and she was now deciding whether to expand the framework or to quietly have a breakdown, and she was leaning toward the framework expansion, because the breakdown could wait and the data could not. She made a note about the ground-penetrating radar image. The note said no bottom. She underlined it once. David had seen it breathe at 9:15 in the morning. One breath. A slow, almost imperceptible expansion and contraction of the circle's edge. Not pulsing, not rhythmic. just the single slow movement of something very large inhaling in its sleep. He had been standing 6 feet away with a mug of coffee that had gone cold in his hand. He did not tell anyone. He told himself he was not certain of what he had seen. He told himself the morning light in the Adirondacks did specific things to perception. He told himself that the 8 hours of sleep deprivation following the night the shadows stood up was a reasonable explanation for visual anomalies. He told himself these things with the fluency of a man who had been constructing reasonable explanations for unreasonable observations his entire life, and he was very good at it, and it had never once worked, and he kept doing it anyway, because the alternative was being the person who said the unreasonable thing out loud. He poured his cold coffee on the ground. He went back to work. He did not look at the circle again that day. The circle, for its part, was not looking at him. It was following him. Day 2, the journal. Ruth came to the circle alone at dawn. She brought her grandmother's journal. She opened it to the page her grandmother had kept for 60 years, the drawing her grandmother's brother had made in the dirt in 1934, before the Dust Bowl took whatever was left of him, that the thin ones hadn't already taken. A circle with a line through it. Crude. Childlike. The hand of a man who had forgotten how to be a man, but had not yet forgotten geometry. Ruth held the journal page next to the circle on the ground. The symbol in the journal had a line through it. This circle had no line. She stood there for a long time with the cold Adirondack morning pressing against the back of her neck, and the pine trees standing with their specific watchful rigidity, and the circle doing nothing, being nothing, existing with that geological patience that was worse than any aggression. Her grandmother's brother had walked into the corn in 1934. The line through the circle was what had stopped it then, something her grandmother's generation had known or done or refused that had put the line through it. An interruption. A limit. The line was gone now. Whatever had been interrupted was no longer interrupted. Ruth closed the journal. She did not show anyone for the rest of the day. She found Marcus that evening after dinner, and she showed him the page, and she showed him the circle, and she watched his face do the thing Marcus's face did when his framework encountered something it had to rapidly expand to contain. Your grandmother's symbol, he said. The line, yes. And this has no line, yes. Marcus looked at the circle for a long time. Who completed it, he said. Not a question. A category of horror he was placing into the correct folder. I don't know, Ruth said. But it wasn't us. Colin came back on day 2. He came back alone early, before most of the compound was moving. He stood at the edge of the circle with his clipboard, and he looked at it for a long time, and then he crouched down, and he reached his clipboard toward it. Not his hand. The clipboard. The buffer of professional distance. And the corner of the clipboard crossed the circle's edge. The clipboard corner disappeared. Not fell in. Not descended. Disappeared. The way a word disappears when you stop believing in its meaning. The portion of clipboard inside the circle's edge ceased to exist in any register Colin's senses could access. He pulled the clipboard back. The missing corner was gone. The cut was clean. Not torn, not burned, not broken. Clean. As if the circle had simply edited that portion of the clipboard out of the available reality. Colin stood up. He looked at the clean edge of his clipboard for a very long time. Then he went and found Elias. I need to tell you something, he said. Is it about the circle? Elias said. Yes. Is it bad? Colin showed him the clipboard. Elias looked at the clean-cut edge. How close were you? Elias said. Clipboard length. Don't go clipboard length again, Elias said. Don't go any length again. Stay back. I'm a structural engineer, Colin said, with the tone of a man explaining why the rule didn't apply to him. I know, Elias said. Stay back anyway. Colin looked at the clipboard. He nodded once, slowly, with the specific nod of a man filing a professional defeat. Ambient temperature, he said quietly to himself. He did not go near the circle again. Day 3, the community meeting. Jake called a compound-wide meeting at the fire circle at 2 in the afternoon. All 340 people, or as close to 340 as the fire circle could accommodate, which meant the inner ring sat, and the outer ring stood, and the people at the back could hear but not see, and would spend the subsequent 3 days getting information from the people who could see, and arriving at interpretations that ranged from the approximately accurate to the cosmologically inventive. Jake stood at the center. There is a circle on the ground in Workshop Row, he said. Most of you have seen it or heard about it. Here is what we know. He listed what they knew. The list was short. The temperature reading. The EMF anomaly. Colin's clipboard. The fact that it had been there since Tuesday morning and had not moved and had not changed and had not done anything aggressive. Here is what we don't know, Jake said. He did not finish this sentence. The list of what they didn't know was not a list. It was a condition. The meeting then did what meetings of 340 people always do, which is to become 17 simultaneous conversations that gradually resolve into 3 dominant factions. Faction 1, Colin's people, 12 compound members who worked in the physical sciences and engineering. They wanted controlled testing protocols, documentation, peer review within the compound's available expertise. They had drafted a 3-page procedural framework on a legal pad. Colin presented it with the brittle confidence of a man who needed the protocol more than he needed the answer. Mira listened to the presentation. She said nothing. She was thinking about the ground-penetrating radar image she had not shown anyone. The image that said no bottom. Faction 2, Marcus's people. Approximately 60 compound members who had come to the compound specifically because they had the theological and philosophical framework to receive what Marcus had been saying since episode 1. They did not need the protocol. They knew what the circle was in the way Ruth's grandmother had known what the thin ones were, not through analysis, but through the accumulated inheritance of every human culture that had encountered this thing before, and tried to leave a warning in whatever medium was available. They were frightened in the specific way that people are frightened when the thing they always knew was real becomes visible in the workshop row on a Tuesday morning. Faction 3, everyone else. Approximately 260 people who occupied the enormous and uncomfortable middle ground between the framework of Faction 2 and the clipboard methodology of Faction 1, and who were experiencing the overlay's primary attack vector, the creeping sourceless despair that arrives when the mind cannot categorize what the eyes are showing it. Sarah watched all 3 factions simultaneously. She was not watching the circle. She was watching what the circle was doing to the people watching it. Her notebook was filling up. Father Callahan did not attend the meeting. He was sitting on a log at the edge of the tree line with a thermos of tea and the expression of a man watching something he had seen before from a new angle. Vance found him there. Vance sat down on the log without being invited, which was his standard operating procedure for most of the social conventions that governed human interaction. You've seen one, Vance said. 3, Father Callahan said. Vance looked at him. 3 locations, Callahan said, before I found this compound. A parish in rural Montana, a monastery outside of Bruges, and a fishing village in the Faroe Islands that no longer exists. What happened at the other locations? Vance said. Father Callahan poured tea from his thermos with a steadiness of hand that cost him something to maintain. Montana, he said. The circle appeared in the nave of the church, stayed for 11 days. On the 11th day, people from the congregation went into it. Not pulled. Walked. Like men walking into a room they had been waiting all their lives to enter. He paused. The circle closed. I was the only one in the church. I have spent 16 years trying to determine if I could have stopped them. Bruges, Vance said. The circle appeared in the chapter house. The monks thought it was a blessing. They built a shrine around it. He stopped. And the Faroe Islands, Vance said. Father Callahan put the cap back on his thermos. I don't talk about the Faroe Islands, he said. They sat in silence for a while. The Adirondack trees stood in their watchful rows. The light was doing the copper thing with the pine canopy. Montana, Bruges, the Faroes, Vance said. And now here. Yes, what's the pattern? Father Callahan looked at the tree line. In Montana, the circle stayed in one place. In Bruges, it moved through the monastery, but without apparent purpose, room to room, randomized. He stopped. And here, Vance said. Here it follows someone, Callahan said. I have never seen it follow someone before. In 16 years. 3 locations. Vance was quiet for a moment. That's different, he said. Yes, Father Callahan said. That is very different. He did not say what it meant that it was different. He did not know what it meant. He had never gotten close enough to a pattern to know what it meant when the pattern changed. He had always been the one who arrived after. This was the first time he was present while it was happening. He did not find this comforting. Day 4, the inventory. Vance came to the circle at midnight. He brought a canvas bag. He worked alone, by the light of a headlamp, with the methodical efficiency of a man who had done customs negotiations in 17 countries, and understood that the key to moving sensitive materials across borders was to project the specific calm of someone with nothing to hide, which he had never once had. He laid his items on the ground beside the circle in a row. Item 1. A piece of iron pyrite wrapped in red thread, purchased from a Romani woman in Bucharest in 2019, who had wanted 3 times what Vance offered and settled for twice, and told him to never open it indoors. He opened it outdoors. He held it toward the circle. The circle did not respond. He wrapped it back up. Item 2. A vial of water from the Zamzam well in Mecca, acquired through a supply chain he was not going to document. Sacred in 3 traditions. He uncapped it and held it over the circle's edge. 1 drop fell in. No response. No sound. No ripple. The drop ceased to exist with the same clean editorial efficiency as Colin's clipboard corner. Vance capped the vial. Item 3. A printed page from the Book of the Dead, specifically the negative confession. The 42 declarations of innocence spoken to Osiris in the Hall of Two Truths. He had acquired it from an antiquities dealer in Cairo who had not asked questions and had been paid enough to continue not asking them. He held the page near the circle. The edge of the page nearest the circle began to curl. Not from heat, from something else. The curl moved slowly, the paper folding away from the circle, the way a living thing folds away from a source of pain. Vance pulled the page back. He made a note. Item 4. A small carved figure, approximately 4 inches tall, made from Adirondack white cedar. He had not brought this from anywhere. He had carved it himself over the past 3 days from a branch that had fallen in the compound's interior. He had been carving it without entirely knowing why, the way the hands sometimes know things the mind hasn't caught up with. The figure was not of anything specific. It was of something general, the shape of a human being at the specific moment before a decision, weight forward, not yet committed to the step. He held it toward the circle. The circle contracted. Not much, half an inch perhaps, maybe less. But it contracted, the edge drawing inward, the perfect circumference reducing, the light swallowing blackness pulling back from the carved cedar, figure the way the paper had pulled away. Vance held it steady. The circle held its reduced size. He pulled the figure back. The circle returned to its original diameter over approximately 10 seconds. Vance looked at the cedar figure in his hand. He had carved it from a branch that had fallen inside the compound, from a tree that had been growing in this specific Adirondack soil for 60 years. He had carved it without knowing why. He thought about that for a while in the midnight dark with the pine trees watching. Then he bagged his items and went to find Marcus. Marcus looked at the figure for a long time. Local material, he said. Yes, you made it here. Yes, from a tree that grew here. Yes. Marcus set the figure down on his desk next to his open copy of the Nag Hammadi texts. The demiurge built the material world, Marcus said slowly, thinking as he spoke, building the argument brick by brick the way he always did. But it built it imperfectly. The Gnostic tradition says the material world contains, embedded in it, inseparable from it, fragments of the divine light, the demiurge captured in the act of creation. Luminous fragments, trapped in matter. He picked up the cedar figure. A tree that grew in this ground for 60 years, he said. The light in the material. The fragment of the divine that the demiurge built into its own prison without understanding what it was building. It contracted from the cedar, Vance said. Because the cedar is real, Marcus said. Made here. From here. By your hands. The demiurge's overlay is not real. It is a projection onto reality. The cedar is not a projection. It is the thing itself. He paused. The overlay cannot process the thing itself. It can only process things that have been converted into its own currency. Despair, fear, rage. The cedar is none of those things. So we have a weapon, Vance said. Marcus looked at the figure. We have an insight, he said carefully. The distance between an insight and a weapon is the distance between knowing the lock can be picked and having the pick. Vance took the figure back. I'll take it, he said. I know people who make things. Day 5 the wait. Reed Calloway could not remember Dessa's middle name. He had known it for 4 years. He had used it in the specific way partners use middle names, as emphasis, as punctuation, as the verbal equivalent of a hand on a shoulder. Dessa Marie. He had known it so completely that it had stopped being information and become furniture, the kind of thing you stop seeing because it is always there. He stood in their container unit at 6 in the morning, trying to find it, and finding instead a smooth, featureless absence where the name had been. Like a shelf that had always held a particular object and was now empty and clean, and gave no evidence that the object had ever existed. He told himself it was fatigue. He went to find his recorder and could not remember where he had left it. He found it eventually, on the table where he always left it. He picked it up and stood there holding it, and tried to remember the name of his first editor at the Times, and found the same smooth absence where that information had been. He did not tell Dessa. He went to the communal area and got coffee and sat with his notebook, and tried to write and found that the writing came fine. The journalist's muscle memory of sentence construction was intact, but the specific details that made journalism journalism, the names and dates and source particulars that gave a story its weight, were thinning, not gone, thinning, like a signal losing strength. He was sitting there when David sat down across from him. David had his own coffee. He set it on the table. He looked at Reed for a moment with the expression of a man who had been having an internal argument for 4 days and had finally arrived at a conclusion. I need to tell you something, David said. Okay, Reed said. I saw the circle breathe on the first morning, David said. One breath. I didn't tell anyone. I told myself I wasn't certain. Reed looked at him. And I've been watching it since, David said. And it follows you, Reed. Not the workshop row, not the compound in general. You. When you leave a space, it disappears. When you enter a space, it appears. I've been tracking it for 4 days and the correlation is perfect, Reed said. Yes, David said. They sat with that for a moment. Why me? Reed said. I don't know, David said. Reed picked up his recorder. He turned it over in his hands. 8 years of corruption stories on the hard drives in their container. Sources in 17 federal agencies. Documents that certain people in certain positions would have preferred not to exist. I make hidden things visible, Reed said. That's what I do. That's the whole job. David said nothing. And it doesn't like that, Reed said. I don't think it's about what it likes, David said carefully. I think it's about what you are, what the function is. The demiurge operates through concealment. Everything it does depends on not being seen. You've spent 8 years developing the specific professional capacity to see what doesn't want to be seen. He paused. You were already marked before you got here. The compound just gave it a fixed address. Reed set the recorder down on the table. He looked at his notebook full of thinning details. My editor's name, he said. David waited. I can't remember my editor's name, Reed said. Not frightened. Stating a fact. The journalist's reflex, state the fact precisely, let the fact carry the horror. For days ago I could. This morning I can't. David looked at him with the expression of a man who had been looking for the right thing to say for 4 days, and had arrived at the conclusion that there wasn't one. Come find Sarah, he said. Sarah listened to David's full account, the breath on day 1, the tracking data across 4 days, the pattern. She listened to Reed's account of the thinning memories. She sat across from both of them at the communal table with her notebook open and her pen still and her attention at the specific quality of focus that other people sometimes mistook for coldness. It was not coldness. It was the absolute silencing of everything that was not the problem in front of her, which was the most expensive cognitive act she performed, and the one she performed most often. The memories that are going, she said to Reed. What's the pattern? Reed thought about it. Specific details. Names. Numbers. Precise information. The kind of information that appears in a published investigation, Sarah said. Reed looked at her. It's not reading your memory, Sarah said. It's reading your files. The specific architecture of what a journalist stores and retrieves. It's learning the catalog system. She paused. Which means it hasn't taken anything yet. It's indexing. What happens after indexing? Reed said. Sarah did not answer this question. She looked at David. The laughter on day 1, she said. The cocktail party laughter in the trees, she stopped. She did not have the narrator's language. She had her own language. The night the shadows stood up. The laughter. What about it? David said. It ended with fear as the beacon, she said. Marcus said fear calls them. The laughter in the trees was the response to the beacon. She tapped her pen against her notebook. I've been watching the compound's collective emotional state against the circle's behavior for 5 days. The circle was largest on day 3, when the community meeting produced the most visible despair. It contracted on day 4 when Vance's cedar figure was deployed, but also when 3 compound members who didn't know about Vance's test were laughing about something near the workshop row. She looked at them both. I think the cedar works because it's real, she said, and I think laughter works for the same reason. Not because it's sacred or folkloric or chemically significant, because it is the specific human function that the overlay cannot replicate. It tried. We heard it try, the cocktail party laughter in the trees. But that laughter was wrong. It was read from a dictionary but never met a human being. She paused. Real laughter is a logic error in its code. The 3 of them sat with that. We need to tell the others, David said. Not yet, Sarah said. Not until I'm certain. She looked at Reed. And Reed needs to stay close to the group. I'm fine, Reed said. Sarah looked at him. You can't remember your editor's name, she said. Reed picked up his recorder. I'm fine, he said again, and they both let him have it, because some things belong to the person saying them. That night, Dessa found Reed at their container unit. He was at his laptop. The corruption files were open. She put her hand over the laptop screen. He looked up. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. He took her hand. She sat down next to him, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and outside the Adirondack dark was doing the thing it did in October, which was to be the specific dark of a very old wilderness that had been dark long before human beings arrived to give darkness a name. Dessa, he said. Yeah, what's your middle name? She pulled back enough to look at his face. Marie, she said. He closed his eyes. Dessa Marie, he said, like finding something he thought was gone. She put her hand on the side of his face. Rid, she said. I know, he said. Tomorrow. She said, you're going to stay close to me. Okay? Both of us close together. All day. Okay, he said. She held him and he held her, and outside the dark pressed against the corrugated steel walls of their container unit with the patience of something that did not experience time the way they did. Day 6, the last good thing. Tommy made coffee at 6:30. Same as every morning. The Coleman stove, the specific aluminum percolator he had carried from his apartment in Akron, with the focused prioritization of a man who understood that civilization was the things you refused to abandon. The smell moved through the compound's morning air, through the cold and the pine and the wood smoke, with the aggressive, defiant ordinariness that had made 3 people cry on the first morning after the shadows stood up. The permanent cast assembled around the fire circle without anyone organizing it. This had become their morning ritual without being declared one. The specific gravity of shared knowledge drawing them together at the start of each day, because the start of each day was when the framework needed to be confirmed, when the continuity of what they understood needed to be reestablished against the overnight uncertainty. Reed and Dessa came together. She was close to him in the specific way of a woman who has made a decision about proximity and is not negotiating it. Tommy poured coffee. The Adirondack morning was cold and bright, and the mountains in the middle distance were doing something extraordinary with the early light the granite faces catching it at an angle that made them look like they were generating the light rather than receiving it. Marcus was talking. Something about the cedar figure, about Vance's test, about the Gnostic concept of luminous fragments embedded in matter. His voice had the quality it got when he was thinking through something important, building brick by brick toward a conclusion he could sense, but not yet see. Mira was listening with her scientist's attention, her notebook open, occasionally interjecting with the specific precision of a woman cross-referencing a philosophical argument against an empirical data set. Father Callahan was quiet, his thermos in both hands, watching the middle distance with the expression of a man who had heard the argument before and found it correct and was waiting for the part where correct wasn't enough. Ruth and Dessa were talking quietly. Ruth had her grandmother's journal. Dessa had one of Reed's hard drives on the table between them, the drive labeled Institutional Corruption 2019 to 2021, and they were looking at it together with the specific attention of two women who had each spent their lives learning to read what institutions preferred to keep illegible. Jake was standing slightly apart, as Jake always stood slightly apart, his coffee untouched, his eyes running the perimeter. David was watching Reed. Reed was in the middle of a sentence about a source he had cultivated inside the EPA in 2020. A whistleblower, a woman named, he stopped. Her name, he said. The group went quiet. My EPA source, Reed said. I've been trying to remember her name for 2 days. He shook his head. It doesn't matter. The point, Elias said from across the fire, is that the EPA's enforcement division in 2020 had a budget of $300 million and made 11 enforcement actions. The year before the overlay went loud, 11 actions. You know what the mob would call that? Capture, Reed said. I'd call it something less polite, Elias said. What would you call it? Reed said. Elias looked at him over his coffee. I'd call it Tuesday. The group laughed. It was a genuine laugh, sudden, collective. The specific laughter of exhausted people who have found the precise corner of absurdity where the horror and the mundane collide and produce something that is not happiness, but is adjacent to it. Tommy laughed from his chest. Marcus laughed with the surprised quality of a man who had forgotten his face, knew how to do that. Even Jake, at the perimeter, turned at the sound of it with something that was not quite a smile, but was the infrastructure a smile would use. Reed laughed. And then the laughter died. The half-second of silence. The hands came from the circle with no warning and no sound and no preliminary wrongness to announce them. There were 3 of them, not human hands. The approximate shape of human hands, the way the cocktail party laughter had been the approximate sound of human laughter, assembled from observation rather than experience, the form without the content. They were the color of the circle, the specific black of something that does not reflect light. They were reaching, and Reed had enough time to turn toward Dessa. That was all. That was the whole measure of the time available to him, one turn, toward the person he loved, in the half-second between the hands appearing and the hands arriving. He did not scream. Dessa did. The scream was the sound of someone watching a person they love become an absence, and it was the most human sound the Adirondack morning had heard since the compound was built, and it went through every person present like a current, and it was still echoing in the pine canopy when the circle closed. Clean. Complete. Like a parenthesis finishing a sentence. Reed's notebook was open on the table. His recorder was running. His coffee cup was still warm. The silence lasted approximately 8 seconds. Then everyone started moving at once toward Dessa, toward where the circle had been, toward each other, the specific chaos of people whose framework has just been stress-tested at maximum load. The circle was gone. Not contracted. Not reduced. Gone. The packed dirt of the workshop row path where it had existed for 6 days showed nothing. No mark, no residue. No evidence of absolute zero temperature or electromagnetic anomaly, or the specific editorial absence of things that had touched its edge. Clean dirt. 6 days of the most wrong thing any of them had ever seen, and the ground showed nothing. Dessa was on her knees. Ruth was with her immediately, the older woman moving with a speed that her frame did not suggest she possessed. Down on the ground next to Dessa, with both arms around her, saying nothing, being present with the complete and uncomplicated competence of a woman who had sat with grief before, and understood that its first requirement was witness. Sarah was standing very still. David was standing very still. They looked at each other. The laughter, Sarah said. David nodded once. The circle contracted when Vance's group was laughing on day 4, Sarah said. It contracted from the cedar figure on day 4, both at the same time. I thought it was the cedar. She paused. It wasn't only the cedar. The laughter made it move, David said. The laughter made it act, Sarah said. It was provoked. The laughter is a logic error. I said that yesterday. I was right, but I didn't understand the implication. She looked at where the circle had been. A logic error doesn't sit still. A logic error produces a response. We laughed and it responded and we didn't have time to. She stopped. Reed laughed, David said. Reed laughed, Sarah said. The weight of that sat between them. Marcus had been listening. He came to stand beside them with his coffee cup and his open Nag Hammadi text, and the expression of a man arriving at a conclusion he had been building toward across 5 days without knowing what it was building toward. Joy, he said. They looked at him. Not laughter specifically, he said. Joy, the Gnostic pneuma, the divine spark in the human being that the demiurge captured in matter. The luminous fragment, the thing it built into its own prison without understanding what it was building. He paused. Joy is the pneuma expressing itself. The laughter is the sound of the divine spark functioning. The overlay cannot replicate it because the overlay has no access to the original. It tried. The cocktail party laughter in the trees was the attempt, but the attempt revealed the limit. It can't experience joy, Vance said. It cannot experience joy, Marcus said. And what it cannot experience, it cannot defend against. And what it cannot defend against is a weapon, Vance said. Is the weapon, Marcus said. The oldest one. The one that was in us before the overlay and will be in us after. The one the demiurge modeled every human weakness into its system and left this out because it cannot conceive of the thing itself. The group stood in the cold morning with Reed's coffee still warm on the table and Dessa's grief in the air and the Adirondack light doing its copper thing with the pines. Tommy picked up his percolator. He poured fresh coffee into Reed's cup and then into his own, and he held his cup up. To Reed, he said. It was not funny. It was not meant to be funny. It was the most serious thing Tommy had said in 6 days, which was consistent with Tommy's relationship to language, which was that he reserved it for things that mattered. But Elias looked at the cup and then at Tommy and said, "You know he would have recorded this whole thing and sold it to the Atlantic." And the laughter came again, different this time, heavier. The laughter of people who are crying and laughing simultaneously, which is not a contradiction. It is the specific human function that proves Sarah's thesis, that demonstrates Marcus's theology, that is precisely and exactly the thing the demiurge has never been able to model. The compound was quiet around them. The trees watched. The mountains held their light. And in the dirt where the circle had been, in the clean and unmarked ground, nobody noticed, in the first minutes after Reed's disappearance, the sound coming from his recorder. Dessa noticed it 20 minutes later when the group had begun to move, to function, to do the things that surviving requires even in the immediate aftermath of loss. She picked up the recorder. She played it back. The recording from the last 6 days was there, Reed's interviews, his notes to himself, the ambient sound of compound life, all of it intact. And then at the moment the circle had closed, at the exact moment of the silence after the laughter, at the moment the hands had come, the recording did not go silent. It continued. Reed's voice, clear, recorded after the circle closed, from somewhere the recorder should not have been able to reach. 2 words, still here. Dessa stood with the recorder in her hands and the Adirondack morning around her, and Ruth beside her, and the group going still as the words played. The recorder's counter continued running. The silence after the 2 words was not empty. It was the silence of a line that had not been finished. Reed Calloway spent 8 years making the hidden visible. In the end, something hidden decided to return the favor. The circle is gone. The ground shows nothing. His coffee is cold now, but the recorder is still running. And in the Adirondack dark tonight, in the space between the compound's lights and the tree line, where the shadows know how to stand upright, there is something that has just learned that the batteries it has been harvesting for 10,000 years contain something it did not account for, something it cannot consume, something it cannot replicate, something it cannot defend against. It is not happy about this. You wouldn't be either. J. Zerga Jr., the heavy metal prophet. End of episode 2. The floor remembers.